Great. So with the basic categorical variable model sort of out of the way, let's think a little bit more deeply about it. So just as a quick reminder and transition from the last video, these coefficients now represent average differences in housing price between the reference neighborhood, neighborhood A, and each of the other neighborhoods. And that's nicely detailed here for each one. So we can manipulate it a little bit, and we can get the average housing price for each neighborhood by simply adding coefficients together. And so you can look through that, and that should hopefully make sense. If a particular coefficient is a difference between the average price in two neighborhoods, then we can add the coefficients together to get the average housing price in that neighborhood. So this is pretty straightforward. And if you want to think about more complicated things, remember, this is just the scenario of the categorical variable neighborhood and price. But what if we want to include something else? What if we want to include a quantitative variable like square feet? Well, from a programming standpoint, it's pretty straightforward. We just add in the quantitative variable that we care about. In this case, let's do square feet. And we approach our categorical variable the exact same way. We just add in all groups of our categorical variable except for one. We leave one out as the reference group. So let's run this and see what we get. So like we expected, I'd say, because our average price differences between neighborhoods was not statistically significant here, it was sure as heck wasn't going to be statistically significant here either. So again, we would not use the neighborhood variable in trying to model these housing data, but this is just for the purposes of seeing how to interpret things. So we'll talk about it a little bit. So what does this model now actually mean, now that I have a quantitative variable in here? Well, because I have square feet in here, the interpretations are a little bit different. Our coefficient for the intercept, originally it was just the average housing price in neighborhood A. Instead now, it's the average housing price for neighborhood A at 0 square feet. Remember, it's still an intercept, and an intercept value is the average value for the response variable when everything else is 0. That includes any quantitative variables like square feet. Therefore, this is pretty meaningless because we're not going to be talking about houses of 0 square feet. Well, how do we interpret the coefficient on our quantitative variable? Well, we can approach it the same way we have right now as we did with multiple regression like we did before. So what that means is to say, I have a slope coefficient of 161.3. What that's saying is holding the neighborhood constant, looking in a particular neighborhood, it doesn't matter which one, but holding neighborhood constant, each additional square foot in size corresponds to an average housing price increase of $161.30. So it's still a typical slope for square feet, but we just have to keep in mind we're holding the neighborhood constant. We're not changing neighborhood in that interpretation. So what do these neighborhood coefficients now mean? they mean something fairly similar to before. So remember before, this was the average difference between neighborhood A, the reference neighborhood, and neighborhood B. Now, this is still the average difference between the reference group, neighborhood A, and neighborhood B, but it's for houses of the same square feet. Said another way, holding square feet constant, looking at houses of the same size, the average difference between neighborhood A and neighborhood B is $7,522.71. So these coefficients in this model are still an average difference between the particular group or neighborhood and the reference group. But now we have to say holding housing size constant or holding square feet constant. Otherwise, it's the same interpretation. And again, this looks kind of weird. These numbers are weird, but that's because it's statistically insignificant. They really don't have any practical meaning in this specific example. So how might this look in general? Well, I just fabricated, and all these interpretations I just went over right here. So I fabricated some basically positions. I don't know if this is exactly where these lines would be, but the general trend and shape of this graph are representative of what we would see here. So what we generally see with a model like this is that each neighborhood gets its own regression line, which should make some sense. I have 4 groups and I have 3 indicator variables. And so I can get, if I set these other neighborhoods to 0, and I'm just left with neighborhood A and square feet, then I have a regression line for neighborhood A. If I take into account the NB variable and zero out neighborhood C and neighborhood D, then I have a regression line for neighborhood B. And similarly, I can get a regression line for neighborhood C and a regression line for neighborhood D. You just plug in the 0s and 1s corresponding to the neighborhood for that particular house. So what this looks like, excuse me, where am I going here? Here we are. So it would look like something like this. The key thing to note, each line has the exact same slope. We're looking at square feet on the x-axis and price on the y-axis. So each line would have the same slope of 161.3. The coefficients now are the difference between the neighborhood A line and the other neighborhood lines at the same housing size, at the same square feet. You can think of it as just looking, you pick a square feet and you can look vertically. And those differences are what are represented by our slope coefficients on neighborhood B, neighborhood C, and neighborhood D. So again, in a model with a quantitative variable and one categorical variable, we have one slope that applies to every group, but we have constant average differences between each group, as shown by each of these lines. This leads into the next natural question. Well, what if my slope varies according to the neighborhood I'm in? So right now, these lines are parallel. What if they're not? What if the relationship between square feet and price changes depending on which neighborhood I'm looking at? This is our classical interpretation of an interaction. So we can move on and say, oh, I can make an interaction term for every single neighborhood that I have explicitly included in my model. Remember when we did interactions before, we would take the 2 variables that we'd want to interact and we would multiply them together. We basically do the same thing here, but now we have to do it for neighborhood B in square feet, neighborhood C in square feet, and neighborhood D in square feet. What that gives us is a royal mess. It is yucky. So we have our reference group still beta 0, representing neighborhood A, when everything is 0, of course. We have our square feet variable. We have what's called the main effect from neighborhood B, the main effect from neighborhood C, the main effect from neighborhood D, and also an interaction term that allows neighborhood B to have a different slope from neighborhood A, an interaction term that allows neighborhood C to have a different slope than neighborhood A, and an interaction term for neighborhood D to have a different slope than neighborhood A. The reason I keep saying different from neighborhood A is because, again, since neighborhood A is our reference group, everything in our model is interpreted with respect to the reference group. So before I run that, let me show you it the opposite way and show you what graphically it might look like. And again, I've fabricated what these numbers are, but the general trends are still what you would expect to see. So for an interaction model, not only do we have different intercepts, but we have different slopes. And so what was this with constant differences and the same slope, in an interaction model now becomes this, or something like this. Every single neighborhood now has a different different slope, a different square feet and price relationship. So what we see is that neighborhood D, and again, these labels kind of fell out of order, but this is just an example to show you that the lines change. So you can just read these in order, and it doesn't matter. This is just showing you how the slopes can vary. So for example, neighborhood D has a different slope for price in square feet. Neighborhood B has a different different relationship for square feet and slope. Neighborhood A has a different relationship for square feet and price. And neighborhood C has a different relationship for square feet and price. That's what this whole mess is showing us, is that we let each neighborhood have its own regression line, basically. And if we were to actually run that in R, we would then have to use I would recommend using the shortcut for interaction by using the colon and adding a term for square feet colon NB, square feet colon NC, square feet colon ND, and running that. And it's a whole mess. And you could read through exactly what each of these. I'm not going to have you work with specifically a model this complicated. So please read through and see how these things are interpreted for your own enrichment and an understanding. But this is getting too messy for our purposes. And if this class was structured differently, we would spend more time digging into this sort of thing. But this I just want to show you is how the interaction stuff plays out. But just as a refresher, these interaction terms are now the difference in the slope. It's the slope difference between the reference group, neighborhood A, and the respective neighborhood, in this case, neighborhood B. So if I want to interpret one of these, let's see, this one. The coefficient on the interaction term of square feet and neighborhood C is negative 1.9. This is saying that the difference in slope, the difference in the square feet and price relationship between neighborhood A and neighborhood C is negative 1.9. So now we'll simplify this in the next video.